This is Dylan Chang with the final sprint of Centipede. Before I get into the gameplay, I'll start with things that I couldn't get to. I couldn't get to attractor mode, I couldn't get to high score system, and I could not implement lives. But everything else is in the game in one way or another. So, here's the gameplay. With this recorder, I'm not sure if you can hear the sound or not, but it works, and you can mute it. So, here's the game. The centipede moves, it's linked, and it's working. The spiders can spawn randomly and move. When the player dies, when getting hit by the centipede or the spider, the wave resets, and mushrooms, as I will demonstrate now, will regenerate. The score is up in the upper left, and when you destroy the centipede, all of them, the wave will start a new wave and spawn everything that's needed, like so. As you can see, there's a separate head, and fleas started spawning, and scorpions spawning, and all that stuff. Score updates properly, and yeah. And there's a poison mushroom, and as you can see, the centipede will have the poison behavior. It's a little weird bug there with the centipede. But let's get into the code. So I'll just go down the list. Blaster. So the blaster is controlled separately by a player controller. The player controller just reads in keyboard presses, set up for a strategy pattern, but it does not make use of it because there's no attractor mode, obviously. The blaster moves within the player space. It collides with all of the enemies and destroys, and it can fire bullets. And so the firing can only fire one bullet at a time, and here's the bullets. So the bullet has a link to the player, so it can tell it when it dies, so it can reset and say the player can shoot again. It constantly moves up. It collides with all the things and all of the critters and enemies and mushrooms, and it either damages or destroys it when it hits. And then, yeah. It's worth noting that all of my critters, all of the bullet, the blaster, they all have factories. Here's an example of the blaster factory. Simple and simple. And then my bullet factory was also a singleton as well as a factory. And here's the how it was made, and here's the CPP file. Next, we'll go to the mushrooms. So the mushrooms are set on a grid. Here's the grid, which I called master grid. Here's the .h file. So it has all of the methods for checking mushrooms, removing mushrooms, adding mushrooms, and making the whole field, as well as getting positions of the mushrooms, so that the centipede can check where to go. So yeah, here's all that. In the grid itself, I have, in the update, is used for resetting the grid when the centipede dies, but before that, it has systems to check mushrooms, to check if the mushroom it's checking is poisoned, to remove the mushroom, to check the play area if the flea needs to spawn, And the flea spawns when there's less than 5 mushrooms in the player area. And then there's the make field, where it just goes through and puts mushrooms in random positions. As you can see, there's the random position generator. And then I have a reset field for when the player dies. In the mushrooms themselves, here's the header file. Standard. I have functions to damage, make poison, check if it's poison, reset mushrooms on player death, so that it gives score, and yeah. So the mushrooms have their grid position, store their grid position based off a pointer to the field. Checks it has an animated sprite so that it can cycle through damage states as well as poison states. It gets damaged whenever it's hit by a bullet. It's poisoned whenever a scorpion hits it, and it resets whenever the grid needs to be reset. Next is Centipede. So the Centipede inherits. There's one base class for the Centipede, and there's the body and the head that inherits from that base class. The base class includes all of the generic functions: moving, turning, updating the grid position, and includes actually creating the Centipede, so creating the segments and promoting segments, as well as resetting the Centipede when the whole thing needs to die during when the player dies. The Centipede has connections to the grid and the game controller. The Centipede has a timer built in so that when it needs to check for its next move, so it's not checking every single update, it will only check when that timer reaches the maximum time it needs. So in the initialize, it's kind of big. So the initialize sets all the grid positions. It sets the directions, and then here this is used for when centipedes are created or when centipede bodies are created. So when it's first creating a head, it will determine a random direction. And when it's creating a body, it'll copy the direction of the segment in front of it. Let's see. And then here we have how the centipede creates the segments behind it. So the segments are created from the segment ahead of it, and I have I pass in when I create a centipede in the factory number of segments that need to be created still. So each segment will have that number, and it will go down until it reaches 0, so that all of the segments that need to be created are created. When it's destroyed, it creates an explosion. It updates grid position every time the action needs to be updated. So it knows where it needs to go next and where it is now. Moving and turning are simple. Here's the smooth turn. Works. Death is complicated. So it updates the grid position. It creates a mushroom where it is, and then it checks if it's a body. It adds. It clears all the pointers If it's in the middle, it'll promote the next segment behind it, and clear the pointer. It'll clear out its action queue, so it starts with a fresh start, and then it tells the game controller that the centipede is dead. There's a counter in the game controller that keeps track of how many centipede bodies are still on the screen during the wave, so it knows when to reset the wave. So here's the create segment. The factory takes in pointer to the grid, a pointer to the game controller, the X and Y positions on the grid, pointers to the centipede segment ahead of it and the centipede segment behind it, the number of segments that still need to be created, and the speed. Promoting segments, it will create a head where it creates a new head where the segment is destroyed, if it needs to, and it'll set all of the pointers to null or point to where it needs to accordingly. Yeah. So the centipedes are connected through pointers to each other. And there's each centipede piece has a pointer ahead and a pointer behind, and those are set when they're created, as I just described. So anyway, here's the centipede body. It doesn't have that much. This is the timer I was talking about. It checks every time the timer reaches the max time it needs to. And then it does... Well, this is when the timer has not actually hit it. It'll check if the current action needs to be moving or if the current action needs to be turning, and it'll do the correct action accordingly. The timer is then added to speed, so it can iterate. And then when it gets to that time, it'll decide whether it needs to, what it needs to do next. So here if it turns, it'll switch the directions, H direction and V direction. And then it'll pass on the instruction to the next segment down. The instructions are based on a queue, so each segment has a queue on it, and that's where the instructions go, and the centipede reads that queue to decide what it needs to do next. Yes. Here's the head. It's a little more complicated. The head basically does the same thing. It waits until it needs to decide what to do. It'll change directions accordingly. It'll pass instructions down. But the thing with the head is that it decides the action. So when the timer's up, it'll trigger decided action, which is this function, which first checks if the mushroom hit a poison mushroom, and if it did, the current action will just automatically go to turning. Otherwise, it'll check the grid for if there's a mushroom in the grid position ahead of it. It'll check if there is, it'll turn. It'll check if it's poisoned. If it is, it'll switch a bool in the centipede to be poisoned, and it'll do all that. I need to split the video, so